Welcome, welcome, welcome. You are listening to Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, Mr. David Seaton. How are you, my good friend?
Fantastic. Let me just give a quick shout out to Earl Winfrey and that cool, smooth jazz he let us in with.
Absolutely. Every week.
Burn that. I got to download that, man.
So we got a lot to cover this hour, as we do every week. I did a video yesterday to let everyone know what we were talking about today. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to actually kind of to really dig into this. So just to give our listeners a little bit of a teaser, our viewers, and thank you, Facebook Live, for tuning in. We're going to talk about whether or not a very serious question. Are we headed back to Jim Crow? Is that what this Trump administration is trying to accomplish? If you look kind of behind the scenes, behind all of the distractions, behind all of the tweets, there's a lot of stuff going on that we need to be aware of. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about the Baltimore Police Department, the killers of Freddie Gray. They've got a lot going on in the past couple of weeks, in so much as their body cameras have shown at least 2 instances with police officers appearing to plant evidence, plant drugs, or whether arresting people for that. One man served 7 months in jail.
Wait a minute, man. You can't. Hey, not all cops are bad.
Right.
Cops don't plant evidence.
Exactly. So we're going to talk about that as well. We'll have a guest with us, Reverend Hagler, who is an activist out in Baltimore. He has been with us before. Excellent guest. So we look forward to that conversation. And we're going to close the show today with a great conversation that we started last week. So last week we talked about the legalization of marijuana, and we had someone on from the Root who was pro-legalization, explaining why we should do it. We want to present both sides of the argument. Today we've got someone from CALM, C-A-L-M, Citizens Against Legalizing Marijuana, to tell us why we shouldn't do it. So we're going to have a great debate later in the show. You do not want to miss that. You want to add something, Dave?
I just always find it ironic that a group that is against the legalization of marijuana would be called CALM.
Yes.
That's just funny to me. Do us a favor. If you're watching the show right now on Facebook Live, share it, because we definitely know that we're going to hit some topics that not only you, but some of your friends are going to be interested in hearing about today. So share the show for us right now. We want to make sure as many people peep this conversation today as possible.
There it is. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we discuss the Baltimore Police Department, what needs to be done with these body cams. We'll be right back on Humanity in the Headlines. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines on IntellectualRadio.com. So, Dave, what we're going to do is switch gears a little bit because I came across this piece written this Tuesday by Monique Judge of The Root, and I thought she just did an excellent job. She actually made our job very easy this week by writing this piece and posing this question: are we returning to Jim Crow? Now, 10 years ago, if someone would have posed that question, to be honest, I probably would have scoffed at the idea. But 10 years ago was before we had a black president.
Agreed.
And now that we've seen the backlash, or what some would call the white lash, from having our first African American president duly elected twice, I think what we're seeing now in the Trump administration, it's a fair question. It's not about, I'm not going to have these debates with people about, well, what proof do you have that Donald Trump is a racist? I'm not getting into that conversation. I'm not here to legislate the man's, not legislate, but to dictate what's in his heart. I don't care about that. What I do care about is what he's doing with his policies and the things that he's permitting under his watch. So let's break that down a little bit. So in this article, she says, every policy decision is cloaked and coded in the dismantling of everything that has helped give marginalized people even the smallest leg up in a society that is stacked against them in the first place. And then she goes on to specifically talk about our esteemed Attorney General, Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions III. And she says, in his short time as head of the U.S. Department of Justice, he has reinstated an asset forfeiture program, which unfairly targets minorities and poor people. He's trying to make fetch happen in the form of the purported war on drugs. He wants to get rid of the consent decrees that hold police departments accountable for the way that they treat everyday citizens. He is the biggest supporter of slavery in the form of mass incarceration, and he advocates for private prison companies to profit from that very same form of slavery.
Not to mention that he wants to go into every state that has either legalized the recreational and or the medical use of marijuana. He wants to basically go in and just decimate all of those states. And that's going to be a huge 10th Amendment issue. But I think the first thing that you mentioned is the asset forfeiture. Just for those of you that are watching and that are listening and that don't know what that is. Asset forfeiture is the law that gives local police departments the legal permission that if they pull you over for a traffic stop and you have you have a large enough sum of cash that they believe, they have the suspicion that it was connected to a crime, they can take that money without any knowledge of a crime, and you have to go then into the system and you have to prove your innocence to get that money back. Now,
and you may not get it back.
You may not get it back. And what the federal government has done and what they're proposing to do with AG Sessions is that the federal government is going to go in with these states, and then the federal government is basically going to take a percentage of that money off top. And then the states will keep a portion of the money because you have a certain redemption period where you can go back and get your money. But this is just basically legalizing police theft.
Exactly, because there are tons of horror stories already out there of people who, for whatever the reason, don't believe in the banking system, or were transporting money for whatever the reason. And again, as you stated, the amount of money that you, and it just kills me because, again, this is the land of the free, home of the brave. Like, we're all about liberty, and you can't be free to carry your money in your car without it being subject to being taken by police if they feel like you didn't gain it legitimately.
And if again, I encourage all of you who are listening and who are watching to Google asset forfeiture. You'll see a ton of stories, but there are two that specifically come to mind, and it's germane to our discussion. One of them was a guy who was in Las Vegas. He went out there, hit some, he won big on the slot machine or whatever. As you know, if you've ever gone to a casino, they don't give you a cashier's check. So he won like $50,000. He's driving home, gets pulled over. Cops search his car, which is already a Fourth Amendment violation, find the $50,000. They take the $50,000, write them a receipt, give them the receipt, and say, "Here's your receipt that I gave you, that I took your money, but it's up to you to come to court and fight to get it back." And then there was another example of this church, I think, and I can't remember where. I want to say it was in either Nevada or Utah, but this church had some fundraiser that they were doing. They raised $10,000. One of the deacons was driving, had the money in the car. Police pulled him over, took his $10,000, and he's sitting there saying, "Hey, I just came from my church. We had a fundraiser today, and this is how I got to take this money to go take it to the bank or wherever he was taking it." They just took his $10,000.
Absolutely. And then additionally, we're talking years in the process, sometimes, of getting your money back, if at all. I mean, it is just a horrible, horrible allowance that I can't believe, again, that we do in a place that is supposed to be about freedom and liberty. But again, our Attorney General is all over that, and that should concern everyone. But again, the asset forfeiture program hits communities, as with anything, harder of people of color and poor communities as well. So we definitely want to keep our eye out for that. Next, she talks about his war on drugs. And this is because we're going to definitely get to the part about marijuana. But this is, again, everyone who is at least 35 or older can remember the crack epidemic of the 80s. And we all know that when Black and brown people were suffering at the hands of crack in their communities, there was absolutely no talk of programs to help them, to assist them, to rehabilitate them. All it was mandatory minimums. And people went to jail for a long time. There were laws written, for those of you who don't know, the law was specifically written to be harder on crack cocaine than powdered cocaine from a sentencing standpoint. So, and again, most Caucasians caught with powdered cocaine, slap on the wrist, very short jail sentences, if at all. If you were caught with small amounts of crack cocaine, you were looking at very, very serious jail time. First offender or not, violent crime attached to it or not, it did not matter. So now we have an attorney general, and obviously that didn't work well, because that just exploded our prison population, right?
Which some would argue was part of the plan.
Right, exactly. So again, we have an attorney general now who is looking to get back to the war on drugs. And again, those things, we know that the disproportionate rates at which African Americans are arrested for drug usage compared to whites are almost 4 times as likely, although the drug usage rates are the same. And we have an attorney general who's all over this, and again, disseminating this information across the country. What do you think of that, Dave?
Well, I want to take it even a step further, because you opened up this conversation and you were positing us talking about the possibility of Jim Crow laws coming back. And Jim Crow laws were the laws that were enacted after the Civil War, after slavery was abolished. But Jim Crow codified treating people of color as a second-class citizen. Basically, there were laws that said that if you were this is after slavery, there were laws that said that if you were an African American, that you could not have the same job or be in the same industry or compete against a white person. So it's about it's about codifying in law, making African Americans or people of color second-class citizens
and disadvantaged.
Right. So again, the part that you're talking about, as far as the disparity in how African Americans and or people of color and people of non-color are treated with drug laws, someone might be able to say, well, you shouldn't just sell drugs. That's the best way to avoid even going into the system. Just don't sell drugs. You won't go into the system. But when you look at healthcare, when you look at the healthcare debate, and you look at how when they're talking about opioid addiction and how opioid addiction is killing white people in suburbs, nobody is having this group of people. They are not being demonized like people of color were during the 80s and 90s, like you just alluded to, when they were using cocaine. It's like we're living in some bizarro opposite universe. We're talking about the people who are using the drugs and saying we can't criminalize these poor people. We've got to get them help. They're sick.
Right.
So there's not the same moral judgment of these individuals who are using these drugs as compared to people of color in the very recent past. They're really not even going after the people. There's been no conversation about going after the company who makes opioid drugs,
Nope.
because that those individuals, again, big surprise, because we're talking about big pharma. Again, and I hate to turn this into a black white thing for those of you who are listening and those of you who are watching. I really hate that, because I would like to have a more a higher level esoteric conversation and have and converse about these things based on their merits. But when you see such a huge disparity in how the same issue, drug use, when you see a huge disparity in how that drug or that issue is treated based on the population of people who are being targeted,
Right.
it always falls along racial lines. You don't see any white people in the suburbs getting pulled over. Oh, I caught you with half a dozen pills. You got to go to jail.
Right.
Oh, I caught you with a bottle of pills. You must be distributing, so you're going to jail for 20 years.
Right. But
You don't see that?
And you don't want to leave meth out of the conversation as well, because the other thing that you haven't seen is any enhanced sentencing or anything enhanced as far as dealing with meth dealers. I've never heard legislation put up there to say, we're going to have a minimum 10-year sentence if you're caught dealing meth.
The only thing that they did is that when you go into a pharmacy now, or you go into a drugstore, you see that line. If you try to buy more than 6 bottles of cough medicine,
right,
they tell you can't do that.
Right.
But again, the bottom line is that this administration is being so blatant and so bright. I mean, they are not even hiding the fact that they have a bias towards, or whether they have a bias or whether they're playing that angle politically to their advantage. Like you said earlier, it's not our job to judge what's in Donald Trump's heart, but the things that he espouses plays into that nativist underbelly of our country. And when you start looking at poor white people, like the people who were at his rally the other day in West Virginia, those people still chanting "lock her up," those are the people that he's talking to, and those are the people that are using the meth, that are selling the meth, that are using opioids, that are selling opioids. But they don't have anything to fear from the government as far as their use and or sale and or distribution of these drugs.
And the sad part about everything that you just said, which is completely true, is that he's not doing anything for them. So we had the jobs report come out, and it's good jobs numbers. I forget the exact number, but the unemployment is down to 4.3%.
The same jobs numbers that Donald Trump said were phony numbers.
Exactly.
He had heard that the unemployment was 25, 37. I even heard 48%.
So, but once they broke down the types of jobs that were being created, you're talking 300 coal jobs. And again, those are the people in West Virginia that are chanting his praises. And we have a president who can't be honest enough with them to say those jobs aren't coming back, and you guys need to go develop another skill set. Get on with this renewable energy. But nonetheless, I don't want to veer too far from what we're talking about, because it was definitely a big week. So then we had this. On Tuesday night, the New York Times broke the news that it was in possession of a Justice Department document outlining a plan to redirect the resources of the DOJ Civil Rights Division towards investigations of and lawsuits against colleges and universities with affirmative action admissions policies that the department deemed discriminatory against white. So they're going to take resources away from the Civil Rights Division towards going after schools that they think are discriminating now somehow against white people in their admissions.
I've got to admit, this is one problem that hasn't had enough light shown on it. I remember when I was in high school and I went and visited 3 Ivy League schools, and the first thing I thought to myself was, where are all the white people?
Exactly.
When I go, you go to Harvard, that's the first thing you'll think, where are all the white people? Go to Big Ten school, there's hardly any white people there. So yeah, the fact that in 2017 we are still having the conversation about whether or not affirmative action as a program, we're arguing the merits of a program that is trying to right historical wrongs. That just the irony that this takes me back to Betsy DeVos when she talked about how there were black universities and HSBCUs, and she was like, that was a good example of coming up with schools, school choice. historically black colleges were created because black people could not get admitted into public universities that were all white. That was codified into law. So we had to start our own schools. So just that, the fact that we're having a conversation in 2017 still in the area of education, and that there's just this, it's just this ignorance of history.
Right.
That saying that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. I don't know if these people are just ignorant of their history or if they're just dismissive of
I
the
think it's
issue.
a combination of the two. And let me add this to the conversation as well, because this writer, she did again an excellent job. Again, her name is Monique Judge. I'm sorry about that. So she says, as far as because she makes a assumption about the whole thing with the affirmative action. She says, my theory is that the reason the Justice Department is going at this from the civil rights angle, and the reason that it is attacking colleges and universities with affirmative action policies first, is that that's the low-hanging fruit that will lead to the ultimate victory, which is wiping out affirmative action in all aspects of American life, including employment. And that's where we get back to the Jim Crow thing again. So, she says, what this does? It opens the door for discrimination in housing. It is opening the door to dismantle the Civil Rights Act from a long con approach. The idea of removing protections is not anything new. These ideas have been in the heads of white people for a long time. Then she goes on to cite Roger Clegg, who worked under the Reagan administration, and he's the president of a group called the Center for Equal Opportunity, a misnomer for an organization hell-bent on fighting affirmative action. But just imagine, we can get rid of affirmative action in admissions in school. We can get rid of it in employment. We can get rid of it in housing. What does that do? That allows completely for segregation and discrimination.
And what I don't understand is, and this goes back to when you're trying to figure out, is this just a way to try and play to that nativist underbelly of the United States, or is this something that people truly believe? Donald Trump, the president of the United States, Donald Trump does not know anyone who is poor. Donald Trump does not know anyone he doesn't have any friends who wanted to go to college, but they couldn't because they didn't get enough financial aid. Donald Trump doesn't know anybody who's, like I said, who's homeless or unemployed or who's not a trust fund baby. So again, that this issue is even coming up, that Donald Trump is even taking the time to try and address what is so popularly referred to on Fox News as reverse racism. I don't even, again, the only motivation he could possibly have for that is that he feels the walls of this Russian investigation closing in on him, and as usual, he's got to come up with some imaginary boogeyman to try and consolidate his base, or to try and keep his base, because he knows his days are numbered. And so he's got to try and think of something else to distract people. And again, when you couple people who have short memories and people who can very easily be incited based on these things like affirmative action, and like I said, people, just the average person just doesn't know, what is uninformed or misinformed, he can take advantage of people like this. That we're even having this conversation in 2017. About affirmative action and like I said, the merits of affirmative action. I'm flabbergasted.
Well, let's wrap it up like this. I want to close with her closing argument here, and again, it's to me, it was absolutely stunning. She lists the things that again are happening here. Take away access to education, remove restrictions that prevent discrimination in hiring and housing, crack down on small-time drug dealers and people in poor communities in every way you can. Take away health care. We saw that with the health care bill. Every single proposed, how many did they have? 5? And yes. Every last bill they had, all it did was provide tax breaks for the rich and take away millions, tens of millions of insurance from people. Cut down on social programs that help the poor. We have that discussion every single budget. Make it okay for an already I can't even say the word, Dave.
Malevolent?
No. You say it.
Militarized.
Thank you. Excuse me, guys. I just had a brain fart. I couldn't get it out to save my life today. But again, we have a police force that, again, looks like a military. And we have no defense against their aggressions, continue to open private prisons, funnel the oppressed and those committing small crimes into that system, and create a new system of chattel slavery that profits off of white supremacy. Call it justice because it has already been enabled by the Justice Department. Sit back and watch their master or your master's plan at work. Be afraid, be very afraid.
And let me just say on the tail end of that, a lot of times we have this conversation and we try to, and that's why I said earlier that I hate to have this conversation as black and white. A lot of times when we see things happening, the first people that it attacks are people of color. The first people that will be attacked with these programs are African Americans, Latinos, Latino Americans, and other people of color. But to all of my white brothers and sisters out there who are listening or happen to be listening, using whatever medium you are using, let me just say this for you in case you don't know. So please believe this. When they are done taking everything they can possibly take from us, if you are poor and white, you're next.
That is the absolute truth, because everything we talk about doesn't just affect black people. Again, we talk very often on this program about police brutality. Black people are not the only people being shot and beat up by police. So again, and once again, you've heard the saying: if you help the lowest man, it helps everybody. So again, the lower we help, the more it helps all of us. So again, this is humanity in the headlines. We're all human, and that's the whole point of the show. But we're going to highlight these injustices and speak for what it is.
Speaking truth to power.
Speaking truth to power, and we're going to be direct about it. And directly, these things are looking to take us back to Jim Crow. And Donald Trump, we're not going to have it. Jeff Sessions, we're not going to have it. You can try, but again, we're on to you and we're watching. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we speak more truth to power and talk about these Baltimore police. Thanks for watching Humanity in the Headlines. We are back. Humanity in the Headlines. Again, I am your host, Tiba Buchanan. Joining me is Mr. David Seaton. Thank you so much, Facebook Live, for watching us and joining us today. We hope this information has been beneficial and helpful, and we're going to keep the conversation going. So, Dave, what are
we talking about now?
We are talking about body cams.
Body cams, and we're talking about police.
In Baltimore.
In Baltimore. Do us a favor really quickly. A lot of people are going to be interested in this story. Share this right now. If you're watching on live, go ahead and share this so we can go ahead and get as many people into this conversation as possible. Post your comments and your questions. Go ahead.
All right, so I got a story here from regular NBC, NBC.com. That's the word there. Another Baltimore police body cam video shows officers plant drugs. A number of criminal cases in Baltimore have gone up in smoke over the past 2 weeks after two Baltimore police body camera videos have allegedly shown officers planting drugs on residents of the city. The most recent video, released Tuesday by Baltimore Police Defense Attorney John Inslee, has led the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office to refer two officers to internal affairs and postpone all cases involving the officers. So this is actually having some type of ramification, but not enough. So 5 cases have been dismissed, including Inslee's client, Shamir Collins, who's 35, whose car appears in the newly released video. It's a terrible situation because the first guy that got busted, again, was in jail for over 7 months because he couldn't afford a $50,000 bail. So what happens is, in case you weren't aware of the story at all, police body cams in Baltimore apparently are on all the time.
I think what was happening with this particular story is, and I don't think the police officers were aware of it, so it's kind of bad that they announced this, but from the time that they hit the record button, their camera captures 30 seconds before they actually hit that button. So it's kind of like on your smartphone. There's some smartphones where you can take a picture and it'll capture a couple of seconds before and a couple of seconds after, and then it'll turn it into like a little video. I know HTC had that function. So again, these police officers, I guess, were unaware that when they hit the record button, the camera was already recording the previous 30 seconds.
Exactly. So, and the camera recorded this police officer taking drugs, putting it in a container, and then coming back to the scene as if that was his first time seeing it.
Right.
So, again, this just an absolute horrible trampling of this person's civil rights. And again, this man spent over 7 months in jail because he couldn't afford a $50,000 bail. And then once his attorney was able to secure the video, he sent it over to the attorney's office, and he was released. So thank God for that.
Right.
So
same thing I saw. There's a similar story on the Huffington Post dated July 30. Baltimore prosecutor throws out 34 cases after officer caught allegedly planting drugs. I don't know how you can say allegedly planting drugs when they have video of it, but 34 cases were thrown out. That means, to your point, there were either 34 people sitting in jail, right, or there were 34 people who had charges that were being leveled against them by Baltimore, and they're sitting there thinking to themselves, what are you talking about? I didn't have any drugs. And it wasn't until this body cam footage came out that these people were exonerated.
So now, in the first case that we mentioned with the unfortunate man being in jail for 7 years, it says 2 of those officers were placed on administrative duty and 1 was suspended. These cases of police evidence tampering aren't helping the image of the beleaguered agency 1 year removed from the U.S. Department of Education Justice report that described the Baltimore Police Department as engaging in a pattern of practice of conduct that violates the Constitution of federal law. So here's the other problem with that, is that the one officer is suspended with pay. The main guy that was caught with the drugs. And how can we take it seriously that they're trying to reform their police? How can we even take policing seriously when they never, ever want to punish the people that are caught doing wrong? He's suspended with pay. That's a vacation. I don't know why they keep putting that out there as if that's a negative thing to the officer. I don't understand that. But again, how can we take policing seriously if they're still having people getting paid to do wrong?
For those of you out there who work in the private sector, and you will recognize this phrase, suspending a police officer with pay is PTO.
Right.
That's all it is.
That's all it is. So again, they say that as if we're supposed to say, yes, thank goodness he's suspended with pay.
Well, they say that under the guise that, well, he's suspended with pay, so he can't be out there doing anything else wrong, even though we're not admitting he did anything wrong because I think we need to change the narrative. Let's change the narrative today. Usually when we have these kinds of conversations, people start the conversations and say all cops aren't bad. I think we need to start saying all cops aren't good.
Right.
Let's change the narrative. Week after week after week, we see stories like this come out, and then police when they interact with African Americans out there, and African Americans are afraid or they have some level of trepidation, they want to act all surprised, like they don't understand what's going on. It's really time for us to say. And in this story, here's the further thing about that story. In Baltimore, where you had the one police officer who was caught on his body cam planting the drugs, he had two other officers with him that saw what he did. So that goes back to something that I've said in the past. For every bad cop out there, there's another 4 or 5 or 6 cops who on and they didn't say anything. Now, if you or I did that, if I saw you murder someone and I didn't say anything, they would call me an accomplice.
Yes, they would.
And they would arrest me as well for not turning you in and for not turning on you and providing the information of what I knew about that crime to the police. So it's not just the police officer who was planting the drugs. It's the 2 officers with him that saw him do it and didn't say anything. It's the supervisor who knows that this guy has gotten a lot of complaints from citizens about him planting drugs, and he looks the other way. It's about his boss or the chief who knows that there are all these issues, that these issues are rampant, that these accusations are rampant in his department, and he doesn't say anything. It's about the prosecuting attorney who looks at this body cam footage, and if it doesn't get subpoenaed by the other side, they know what's going on and they look the other way. We're talking about an entire system and that is corrupt, that needs to be pulled out, like they like to say about Obamacare, needs to be pulled out root and branch so that we can get rid of this corruption.
And that's the problem, because we can never get the conversation to that level, because what they immediately want to do is talk about one bad cop. And it's not one bad cop. It's a systematic problem. And that is the one thing you cannot say. Well, don't say anything about the system. Don't blame the system. This is the best system in the world. No, it's not.
On a related story, it's not about Baltimore, but I posted this on my Facebook page. So for those of you who are friends, you can find it there. But I just have to bring this up for just a quick second. This was posted on just the other day, August 4th. An ex-Alabama death row inmate seeking compensation for 30 years of hell. And this story is talking about Anthony Ray Hinton was arrested 30 years ago, charged with double murder. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, so forth and so on. It took a nonprofit organization to actually come out and research his case. They went back and did a ballistics test, tested it with the bullets, that blah, 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 and they found out that he was innocent. This guy was in jail for 30 years because of bad police work. What does that, so if it, and the same thing is happening today. The only difference in these cases in Baltimore is that young man that was released after the 7 months, if there was no body cam footage, he'd still be sitting in jail.
Exactly.
He'd be another Anthony Hinton, except it's happening in 2017 as opposed to 1987.
And that's the sad part, because the question you're raising is, how many times has it happened that we don't know about? We have 2 instances in 2 weeks, but in all likelihood, those aren't the only. We're not 2 for 2.
Right.
Right. There's probably, and we've seen that, I think, in Alabama, that there were thousands of cases where the cops were planting evidence. We've seen this for years. So again, it's very disheartening. And out of Baltimore in particular, again, the purveyors of the killers of Freddie Gray. And we've seen this time and time again out of Baltimore. So again, it's just very disheartening. But I'm so glad that there's some degree of karma and justice for these things to be brought to light.
And let me just say this. I feel it's incumbent upon us to speak truth to power, especially on this issue. Citizens are not going to continue to accept this. Citizens are not going to continue to allow their lives to be disrupted, the lives of their loved ones to be disrupted, to be framed for crimes they didn't commit, to watch people in their community get murdered with impunity. Citizens are not going to continue to take this. It is only a matter of time before citizens are going to spontaneously somehow rise up, and it's the best way to avoid that calamity is for police officers and the people who are in positions of authority to take stock of their policies and practices and look for ways to ameliorate the behavior of their police officers. But I'm telling you, mark this day, citizens are not going to continue to take it.
We're going to have to leave that conversation there. We've got so much to talk about today. We've got just a few minutes left. Hang in there. We're going to talk about this legalization of marijuana in just a few minutes. You are watching Humanity in the Headlines. We will be right back. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Thank you so much for hanging with us.
Facebook friends, anybody you know who has an opinion one way or the other about the consumption and or the legalization of marijuana, share the show really quickly because you don't want to miss this last 15 minutes.
Absolutely. So we are excited about this conversation. Last week, we began this discussion by talking about the legalization of marijuana from a pro standpoint from it. You know, we spoke with someone that was definitely for it, and we talked about some of the benefits, but we'd like to be able to present both sides of that argument, let you choose for yourself. Joining us today is Mr. Scott Chipman. He is the Southern California chair of the Citizens Against Legalizing Marijuana, also known as CALM. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for joining us today. And as you are our guest, I would like for you to go ahead and have the first word to let our listeners know exactly what CALM is about and your position on the matter.
Sure. CALM is a political action committee. We were organized in about 2009 to help defeat legalization of marijuana in 2010, which we did here in California. We helped defeat legalization of recreational marijuana in Ohio. We work locally to try to get regulations in place that will block the commercialization of marijuana, as well as we work statewide and we help people organize CALM chapters anywhere in the nation.
Okay, so if you could let us know then how you got to be in that position, not the position of your situation with CALM, but your position on not wanting marijuana to be legalized.
Yeah, well, in my own community, we had about 13 drug paraphernalia shops, and our community, we were trying to improve our community in San Diego, Pacific Beach, and we got together and said, this doesn't seem right. Why are people selling drug paraphernalia? And we checked the state law, and it's against the law to sell drug paraphernalia. And so we started organizing to get rid of this merchandise in these stores. And while we were doing that, a store opened up selling marijuana. It didn't have a city permit, but the landlord gave them the key, and they started selling marijuana and advertising. So we changed our focus. And we filed complaints, and within a year, we had 25 stores selling marijuana in our community and 250 in the city at large. Not one had a city permit. They were all just drug dealers behind glass doors. And that sucked us in, and we met people across the state who were having similar issues. We checked all the facts related to teenage use of marijuana, the potency. Remember, this was back in 2007, 8. We kept getting stronger and stronger. More kids were getting addicted. We set up a website. We started getting phone calls from parents whose kids were having psychotic breaks, who were dropping out of school, who were addicts. The number one reason for a young person to go into addiction therapy is for marijuana use. And it's just snowballed as the movement to legalize has increased. The need for a group like ours and more groups like ours to push back against legalization has increased.
Mr. Chipman, this is David Seaton again. Thank you for joining us today. As I'm listening to you speak, and I didn't do a huge amount of research on your organization, but does your organization have any religious affiliation?
No, we're nonpartisan. We're basically a public health and safety organization. We're a political action committee. So we did that purposely because if you're going to fight drug dealers who have lots of money, you have to be able to do and say anything you need to get your point across. So we are not although we have a 501c3, we are a 501c4.
Okay, that's interesting. And just so that we kind of have an understanding of the political side of this, where have you found the most support since you're a political action committee, where have you found the most support either in Congress or at the state level in California for your agenda?
Well, U.S. attorneys, we meet every year or more than once a year with our local U.S. attorney. We try to get other people across the state to meet with their U.S. attorneys. U.S. attorneys have had their hands tied by the Obama administration on drug dealers, and particularly related to marijuana. You have to realize the marijuana of today is not like beer. You know, it's 10 to 40 times stronger than the marijuana was of the 1960s and 70s. You've got dabbing, you've got butane, hash oil, you've got edibles. These can be the THC of the Cheech and Chong era was 3% THC level. That's the part of the marijuana that gets you high. The THC levels of today of low strength marijuana is 15% THC. Higher hybridized marijuana, smoked marijuana, can be 25%, and you get into dabbing and edibles, and you can be 50, 60, 90% THC. This is very dangerous drug. This is the crack cocaine of marijuana that our kids are getting exposed to today.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Chipman.
Back to your political question, you know, we lobbied hard for Jeff Sessions because we knew his position was we've got to follow federal laws, and the federal laws are, and the national treaties that have been in force for 25 or 30 years are that we do not allow drug dealing, that we work against drug dealing. And the marijuana sellers of today, the traffickers, are nothing more than drug dealers. We complain a lot about drugs coming across the border of Mexico into the United States. More marijuana comes out of California to the rest of the country than all the marijuana coming across the border of Mexico. We produce 8 times more marijuana in California than we consume. So we are the drug traffickers, the drug cartel for the United States.
Let me ask you this, and then again, that's a really complete answer. So I appreciate you giving us those stats. I would stick a pin in the point of the federal law, because it's always amazing to me on the Republican side how they like to espouse the 10th Amendment and states' rights when it's about an issue that they agree with. But now we're talking about marijuana legalization in certain states, and now we want to talk about the authority of the federal government. But that's that point aside. I
don't think so. It's not an aside. Let me address that. It has to do with what kind of issue you're talking about. Drug trafficking, as I just said, in California and Colorado. Colorado marijuana has been found virtually in every state of the nation. This becomes a cross-border issue, and that's why the Controlled Substance Act is a federal act. It's not about states' rights, even though the drug lobbyists and those people who promoted so-called medical marijuana fooled citizens into voting for it. Remember also that there was in 1974, I believe it was, we had the energy crisis, and the federal government said everybody's going to lower your speed limit to 55 miles an hour. Some states said no. And the federal government said, okay, we're not going to send you any federal highway dollars if you don't. And everyone said yes. And this is the same thing. This is a national public health and safety issue. Is cross-border trafficking is very common, and that's why it should remain a federal issue.
Okay,
and there's also the international treaty issues.
Sure, and that's why I said I didn't want to turn this into a constitutional necessarily, conversation. But what I did want to ask you is this, because I noticed you were talking about each year that the potency and the potency of the THC was getting stronger and stronger. You said your organization was getting calls from parents saying that their kids are addicted and having psychotic breaks and so forth and so on. What I noticed you didn't, and again, just full disclosure, we're playing devil's advocate because we want to make sure that we're having a substantive conversation for our listeners. Absolutely. And for our viewers. But let me say Absolutely. This: the one thing you didn't say is that you didn't cite any deaths from the consumption of marijuana. There are tens of thousands of Americans who die every year from cancer from smoking, from overconsumption, from cirrhosis of the liver and alcoholism, or dying in alcohol-related car crashes. My point in bringing that up is, wouldn't we be best served if we have a finite amount of resources and energy to try and better the circumstances for everyone, and there are no marijuana-related recorded deaths? Wouldn't it be a better allocation of our resources to fight against things like tobacco and alcohol and leave marijuana alone? Because at the end of the day, it's a victimless crime.
Well, no, it's not a victimless crime unless you are living off in the woods by yourself, because we're all impacted. You mentioned, I'll go as far as I can with this, which is a long ways if we have the time. But you mentioned drunk drivers killing people. Well, drug drivers have now, killing people have now eclipsed drunk driving. And marijuana is associated with over 30% of the drug driving deaths. And this is a very low number compared to what's reality, because as soon as you use marijuana and alcohol and they test for alcohol, they say, oh, well, it's a drunk driver. So this is an underreported number. If you use marijuana and alcohol together, the impairment is 5 to 8 times worse than marijuana or alcohol alone. So the traffic safety issue is huge. As far as people dying, people did not die of smoking a cigarette. They died of smoking packs of cigarette for 30 years. You do that same thing with marijuana and you'll have the same results. Marijuana has all the same carcinogens as tobacco. As a matter of fact, it has 20 times more ammonia. It dramatically impacts the heart and the lungs. And nobody ever drove the long way on the freeway after smoking a cigarette. Nobody ever left their 14-month-old in the car to die. Their 4-month-old in the car to die for 14 hours after smoking a cigarette. Nobody ever got couch locked so badly that they couldn't get off the couch to get their baby out of the swimming pool. We have those incidents happening all the time with marijuana. We had a kid in Colorado stab himself to death, 20 stab wounds. Who can stab themselves 20 times? This is a psychotic break. We had a guy come home from eating an edible in Denver. He threatened to commit suicide. He got his gun out of the safe. His wife is on the phone with 911. He changes his mind. He shoots her in the head. He's in prison for life. And 2 grandkids are now being raised by grandparents. So my point is, I could go story after story after story on this. Jared Lautner shot Gabby Giffords and a dozen or so other people in Arizona, marijuana users. The Serenov brothers who blew Boston bombers, they're marijuana users. Colorado theater shooter, marijuana users. People are not getting the whole story about marijuana. I've got dozens of pages of psychotic breaks related to marijuana causing death.
Okay, so this is a T, but if I could just jump into the conversation for a minute. Here's my perspective with this, and you let me know what you think. I try and approach this from a very common sense perspective. I've never used marijuana. I'm 43 years old, likely won't. I have no interest in doing so. So I don't say what I'm about to say as a marijuana user. But you cited concerns about high school children being addicted and marijuana being so much stronger. Wouldn't it make more sense then to legalize it so that way it can actually be reviewed like food is, like alcohol is, and then be regulated up to a standard? And so let me finish the point, because if we then have a standard, then that makes it safer for everyone to use, for the people that decide to use it. Additionally, it is still against, so we have, when you look at alcohol, it is against the law for high school children to drink alcohol. You think about the one kid that got off for killing 4 people. He was 16 years old.
Right.
He was drunk. So my point is,
the affluenza kid.
Exactly. My point is, we can still put but we have laws in place to deal with people who are alcoholics or who are drunk on alcohol and then go drive. We can do the same thing with marijuana. If you're caught high driving, there should be a penalty for that. However, just like alcohol, for the people that are old enough to consume it, and they, in my opinion, they should have the ability to do so, again, as there are 0 recorded deaths of someone overdosing on alcohol. And you can, and as a matter of fact, there are more recorded deaths of people overdosing on water, because that's actually possible to do that. So to me, it's just a common sense thing.
I would dispute the numbers. I mean, I can go and give you people who have died on marijuana, but that's not the big issue. We're not here to say, oh yeah, so many people are dying as a result of marijuana, but it is a gateway drug. 50%.
As is alcohol.
Yeah, but alcohol use, everybody complains about alcohol use, but nobody's arguing out there to reduce the potency of alcohol, to ban alcohol. But they all say alcohol is horrible. Well, why would we, if alcohol is horrible and marijuana is just as bad, and I have got the facts to prove that, then why, we've got 65% of the population who are using alcohol. Why would we add another psychotropic, addictive, dangerous, impairing drug to the problems we already have? The evidence is that nobody reduces their alcohol consumption as a result of going to marijuana. They just add marijuana to the mix. Alcohol use in Colorado has gone up. And the idea that you're going to regulate people, you say, oh, well, teens are always getting in trouble with alcohol. So why don't we just legalize marijuana and then we'll regulate the marijuana? Well, we've done a great job on alcohol with teens, right? So we're not going to do a good job on the marijuana either. And the message is the wrong message. When you say, oh, we're going to make it legal, we're going to tax and we're going to regulate it, the kids all say, great. They're only complaining about how old I am, whether I can use it or not. It's not about how bad it is. We got to think about this in the long term. What is the kind of country we want to live in? Do we want to live in a country where every day, several times a day, several days a week, people go to an altered mental state because what's going on in their lives that they can't get a hold of their life and they want to get to this altered mental state? This is a problem. And the opioid
so you have a moral conviction. You have a moral conviction against
legalization.
Right. So you're speaking from the morality of it, and I think the point that we're making.
I'm talking about the public health and safety of it.
Right, but I think the point that we're making is, and I think the facts bear this out, or at least the numbers bear this out. The legalization of marijuana is there's no one I know, and there's no one in this country who likes to consume marijuana and then they go to California or Colorado on vacation, get high, go back to a state where it's not legal and say, man, I sure wish I could get high, but I can't because it's not legal in my state. Point is that there's not going to be any more people who are going to consume marijuana by making it legal, and by making it legal and regulating it, you can avoid those kinds of things because a lot of the things that you're talking about psychotic breaks and things like that, just with my knowledge of marijuana, because I do know a lot of people who consume it regularly, that sounds more like to me individuals who are smoking marijuana that's laced with something else.
Or synthetic marijuana.
Right. The individuals that I know who are smoking regular marijuana that isn't laced with any other chemical, I've never heard of anybody having a psychotic break. I have heard of somebody having a psychotic break where they smoked a joint that was dipped in embalming fluid. I heard of that person having a psychotic break.
According to the science, you're wrong. 5 times more likely to have a first-time psychotic break if you're a marijuana user. I'm talking about just straight THC.
Okay.
And the numbers that you described is just your opinion. It's not borne by the actual numbers. What we have found that every state that has medicalized marijuana and every state that has legalized marijuana, the use goes up. The young people's use goes up. The middle-aged people's use go up. The older people's use goes up. And not only that, so every age group the use is going up. But the strength that they use and the amount that they use goes up.
Yeah.
Legalizing it and trying to regulate it actually gives people a green light. We should send the proper messages about marijuana, and the messages that we're sending right now are horrible messages. That it's medicine, that it's okay, that it can't hurt you. Out of every 100 stories about marijuana in the news, less than 3 say anything about the harms.
Well,
you see stories about cigarettes, and most of the stories about cigarettes are about the harms.
And as far as just as a correction, my numbers about the consumption of drugs in general, once they have come off of the list of prohibition, and the consumption not going up by the aggregate, is borne out by numbers that are recorded by the CDC and the federal government, and about alcohol.
Your bigger point is that people are going to get high anyway.
Right. My larger point that I'm trying to make, irrespective of, because again, we could argue about the numbers, but my point is that there's no one in the United States who wants to smoke marijuana who says to themselves, man, I live in Illinois and it's not legal, so I guess I'm not going to smoke it.
Right. They're going to smoke it
illegal
anyway.
Sends the right message. If you want to break the law, I go 75 miles an hour on the freeway. That's not the point. I don't want it to be legal to go 95 miles on the speed limit or on the freeway, or eliminate the speed limit. We've got to have guidelines, and keeping it illegal is a good guideline.
All right.
We're gonna have to leave it there. We thank you so much for being on today. We might have to have a part 2 of this discussion, because we didn't even get into
any time.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We didn't even get into the financial benefits of legalization. So there's a lot of
financial harms of marijuana.
Tell our listeners how they can find out more information about Calm and how they can follow you.
Yeah, just go to calmusa.org. And we have a blog and a Facebook. So Calm USA or calmca.org, either one. Thank you very much.
Man, thank you so much, Mr. Chipman.
We will definitely be in touch.
Call me anytime. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care. Another great show, great segment. I wish we had more time for him.
It's amazing to me how, whether or not you are pro an issue or con an issue, whether you're for or against it, everybody has all this irrefutable data to back up their contention. That's amazing.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for listening to and watching Humanity in the Headlines today. We hope you join us next week. We'll be back to do the same thing. We thank Mr. Breon Jones putting together a great show, and of course, Mr. Earl Winfrey for this wonderful, blessed platform. And you guys be safe. Enjoy this wonderful weather. We will see you next week on Humanity in the Headlines.